spotlight, and we will start with a land acknowledgement. Wherever you are located on Turtle Island today, please think about the traditional lands you are currently situated on and join us in acknowledging and thanking the generations of Indigenous peoples who have cared for these lands and in celebrating the continued strength and spirit of Indigenous peoples. Welcome. I'm Linda Baker, the Learning Director at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children. On behalf of the Learning Network team, I would like to welcome every one of you to this resource spotlight titled, It's Time to End Violence Against Women in Politics. Arzu Najibzadeh is a rising voice for women's civic and political leadership in Canada. As the founder of Platform, Arzu is boldly transforming civic spaces to reflect the lived experiences and leadership of Black, Indigenous, and racialized young women and gender diverse youth. I'm delighted to turn it over to you, Arzu. Welcome.
Thank you, Linda, for that warm introduction. I'm so excited to be here with you folks. Thank you so much for joining us. Those of you who know me know that this is my favorite subject ever, and it was really hard for me to try to condense everything that I want to say in 45 minutes, but I hope that you will have a deeper understanding of how violence against women manifests in political spaces after this conversation, and to really have some food for thought in terms of engaging young women and really recognizing how power moves within civic institutions to uphold patriarchy and misogyny and sexism as they intersect with other systems of oppression like, anti-Black racism, colonialism, and ableism. So my name is Arzu. My pronouns are she, her, and they, them. I'm the founder and managing director of Platform. And we are, again, really focused on understanding what it is that racialized young women need in order to succeed in the political spaces, and really also to transform our definition of leadership and civic spaces in order to really create spaces where our needs can be advanced meaningfully. And that's why we work through an anti-oppressive, intersectional, and transformational lens. I want to acknowledge by saying that the lands I'm coming to you from are fall on Treaty 13 as a part of the Williams Treaties, and continue to be on the land of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum agreement, which was an agreement between the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas to bring them together in stewardship and preservation of the land and their relationships with the earth, with water, with animals, with plants, and all of the different people that they came into contact with, specifically their own communities. And I think as settlers and as someone who's been living on these lands for the past 10 years, I really want to make sure that I live up to at least the spirit of that agreement by understanding that my liberation as a Muslim woman, as an immigrant, will never come unless I'm able to take part in meaningful relationships and solidarity work with the Indigenous people that continue to live on these lands. And I really encourage you folks to read the calls for justice for everyone that were outlined in the final report of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Inquiry, to ensure that at least in your personal life, you are engaging in behaviors and in work that really dismantles anti-Indigenous and colonial violence against Indigenous women, girls, trans people, and Two-Spirit people. Today, we will explore the topic of violence against women in politics through three different categories that are all interrelated. I've broken them down to make sure that we're building a narrative towards understanding how and why is it that women in politics currently experience gender-based violence. So we're going to start with, again, an understanding of what do we mean when we talk about gender-based violence and how it shows up in Canadian politics, the root causes and the historical causes of gender-based sexual violence, and also strategies to challenge gender-based sexual violence and sexism in all of its different forms against women in politics. I want to begin a quote by Audre Lorde, Black lesbian feminist author, poem, that reads, "There is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives." So I could come out here and talk about, feminism and a gender first approach and the importance of a gender lens, but I recognize that I am impacted by more than my gender. A lot of us, women with disabilities, poor women, working women, Black women, Indigenous women, Asian women, as we've been hearing more in the past few weeks, there are so many intersecting parts of our identities and experiences that shape who we are and how we move through the world, that it is only through intersectionality and a full analysis of how all of these systems of power work to uphold oppression against us that we can understand how we can then dismantle these systems of power in an anti-oppressive way and in ways that really address our problems at the root cause. And again, intersectionality, of course, a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and it refers to, again, just a method of analysis. I know that a lot of us have reclaimed it through linguistics as a label, but it's really a method of analysis that shows why and how people with multiple intersecting identities are marginalized, again, in different ways and at higher rates. So this definition of violence against women in politics by the International Knowledge Network of Women in Politics gives a broad range, but also a very clear vision of what it is that we are talking about when we use this term. And it refers to the physical, psychological, or sexual aggressions taken to shorten, suspend, impede, or restrict the exercise of their office, or force a woman to make decisions against her will. And again, when we talk about violence against women in politics, I think we need to, take ourselves out of this context for a while, really look at gender-based violence and what purpose it serves in our political systems, but also in the broader society and why it takes place. But before we do that, I want to talk about the gender binary. Right? Our whole world is based on the gender binary. It's this essentialist classification of gender into two distinct opposite forms of masculine and feminine. You're either a man, you're either a woman. Trans identities don't exist. And based on this essentialist nature of you as a woman or a man, there are specific gender roles to which you have to adhere in order to, again, maintain the binary. So for the purpose of this conversation, women are often referred to as maternal and emotional, when men are logical and aggressive, right? So when we talk about women in politics, there's always this double standard that, when women enter a room, everyone is just more civil, people are more likely to work each other, they're constantly looking for common ground. And then suddenly when the woman stops adhering to that idea, when she starts pushing for her agenda or not really playing by the rules, she's suddenly not a team player. And we're going to talk about examples of that and how that has shown up in Canadian politics. And this gender binary, those of you who come from a sociological background may know this already, but is maintained through a series of actions under the term gender policing. And what gender policing refers to is this enforcement of normative gender ideals or gender roles associated with the gender binary onto individuals. So, from very early on, boys don't cry, like, why are you wearing pink? Boys don't wear pink. Those are some of the very subtle socialized ways of gender policing that we are raised with as we grow up. And then they seek to devalue or delegitimize expressions, gender expressions that deviate from normative concepts of gender. And then again, reinforce that gender binary, right? Like a lady's like quiet, she's poised, she's graceful, you're not aggressive, you're not bitchy. And then while those same behaviors are actually like encouraged and nurtured and normalized in little boys and men. So these normative gender performances are encouraged and rewarded. We see it when in representations when, there's a specific type of woman, there's a specific type of person who is accepted into the norm, who is rewarded, who is upheld as the perfect idea or representation of womanhood, versus non-normative performances that are discouraged and then punished through generally negative reactions or through harsher mechanisms. So that can look like girls being sent home for showing too much skin, right? Like girls being sent home from school for wearing shorts. And we usually see this like portraits more specifically onto like fat bodies and fat girls, like a poised and a graceful and an acceptable gender performance for a fat woman is to cover up and to try to hide her body and not be too sexual, while it is encouraged and it's normalizing men and boys to treat women sexually and to objectify women. So we see how just the mere existence of fat bodies, of fat women's bodies, is policed and ashamed, versus that like inherent sexualization that appears to just be an essential part of boys and men is just allowed to go under the radar. So that's how gender policing works. And its relation to violence against women in politics is that when women step out of the private sphere and enter fields dominated by men, where they have to engage in traditionally masculine work and traditionally masculine power and traditionally masculine forms and behaviors, this is then viewed as an anomaly. And as a result, violence against women in politics is the punishment, is the negative reaction to women stepping out of that gender role of doing domestic labor, of being involved in maybe like more feminine spaces, like healthcare and healthcare and education work, which we know that even in those spaces, women do face violence and gender-based violence specifically. But when we're talking about politics specifically, when we are looking at a House of Commons, when we're looking at a political system that was created to not only maintain the status quo and uphold white supremacist patriarchal power, but to actively use violence against women, specifically when we're talking about Canada, violence against marginalized women, Black and Indigenous women, as a way of creating that power, then women entering these spaces becomes an anomaly. And it's something that needs to be fixed. It's something that needs to be addressed. And even at this point where women are starting to assimilate into these forms of power and into these systems of governance, this, the gender binary and our inferior position is reinforced and reaffirmed even in institutions where we do have power through violence, through sexism in all of its different forms. And historically, this may seem like it's a reach, a far reach to people, but I've been studying this for so long. And when you do that, I think the lines and, you see a clear line between like the history of the witch hunts in Europe and then colonialism and then the current experiences of women in politics. So the witch hunts were really about women's power, knowledge, and wealth, and how they threatened emerging capitalism and patriarchy as it related to enforcing and upholding that capitalism. So they basically served to displace women as reproductive knowledge holders, matriarchs, and landowners. So one thing I want to remind folks is that with the emergence of capitalism, it's really at least in like a European Christian context, is when you start seeing something called the enclosures. So land that was previously for public use, for festivals, for religious purposes, for public gatherings in a feudal market system or economic system, had to be privatized in order to be able to, again, exploit it. So when through the witch hunts, we see a lot of older women, a lot of young widows, a lot of widows in general, and women who had inherited wealth and power from their families being some of the people who were actively accused of witchcraft, whose power or knowledge of reproductive justice, and again, looking at reproductive labor as a form of, again, creating workers for the capital. So all of these things, like land and like reproduction, where women previously had some power over, suddenly being used as threats and targeted throughout the witch hunts to ensure that, again, land was becoming property of the state, that it was being privatized, that it did not belong to those women whose subjugation was now crucial to the emergence of a capitalist patriarchy. And again, the privatization of women's labor within the household. And it was really one of the first instances of kind of wide range public and state sanctioned punishment against women who did not adhere to these emerging capitalist and patriarchal expectations. So women who, for example, had access and knowledge to women's reproductivity, women who could help other women induce abortion through, I don't know, like teas and different methods. Those old women who were knowledge holders within women's spaces, those were targeted as witches. So that knowledge, that power, and that understanding of women's needs and leadership was suddenly viewed as a threat. And that's where we see the witch hunts emerge. And one of the examples of that, even in the 1500s, Anne Boleyn, for those of you who know her, I mean, I'm obsessed with her, and that's really what got me started into learning more about the history of women's voices in politics. Specifically, again, I want to make sure we understand that this is within a Western European context. Was Anne Boleyn. She was Queen of England, mother of Queen Elizabeth I, second wife of King Henry VIII, who we don't like, and who was accused of practicing witchcraft and executed for adultery and treason. So within that gender binary, again, women are, again, you're supposed to be chaste, your sexuality is supposed to be for reproduction only, not for pleasure purposes. And Anne Boleyn was someone who was not only accused of witchcraft, but who was tried on the basis of adultery and treason and executed because of that. What we don't often hear about is that Anne Boleyn was an active political actor through her time. She was an active advocate for redistribution of church revenues and church profits to the poor. She was involved actually in passing a poor law that gave the responsibility to local officials and authorities to find employment for the poor. And she was an active critic of Thomas Cromwell's foreign policy throughout kind of the end of her life. So when we see the historical proof that this is the person who Anne Boleyn was, and this is what she did, and then having her being tried as an adulterer and under the guise of witchcraft, Thomas Cromwell wrote this letter where she said that like Anne Boleyn has a sixth finger on one of her hands. All of those things, we see how the discourse or the moral panic about witchcraft and women who had some kind of magical power and were practicing it was emerging again, at a time where someone like Anne Boleyn, even within like the oppressive nature of the British monarchy and the economic and the political system of the 1500s, was exercising some power and was doing something. So, the witch hunts and just general public shaming and punishment of women who may have had sex outside of marriage, who may have been politically active and criticizing what men were doing in the field of politics, again, in a very patriarchal system such as the British monarchy, you see how that connects and how that's a historical perspective and maybe one of the most well-known examples of how the witch hunts were really kind of a hoax and a scam to take over women's power and ownership of the land. So some historians go as far as saying that the witch hunts were like the biggest land theft in European history. So that's that. But coming to Canada through the era, the time of colonization, and at a time where Indigenous women in Canada right now continue to face so much violence and marginalization, We need to mention the fact that prior to colonization, women across many indigenous cultures participated in public life and held leadership positions. They were responsible for landholding, for resource allocations. They often advised their communities on decision-making. And it was only through the colonization and enforcement of Euro-Christian patriarchy that indigenous women's roles as leaders were undermined. And patriarchal violence against women actually became a tool for colonization. So, indigenous women, they had sexual freedom. These communities were matrilineal. Wealth was passed down through mothers. They were very like matrilocal. So it was only through the enforcement of Christianity by missionaries and by colonizers that indigenous men were encouraged, and there was this culture created, whereas, like, you're the man of the house, you need, like, your wives need to be converted, your kids need to be converted, this is how it's going to be. And it was through that process that patriarchy and violence against women was introduced and normalized to an extent within indigenous communities. So all of this violence that we currently see, we have former Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper referring to the issue of missing and murdered indigenous women as something that, it's mostly done by indigenous men, it's only done within their communities, it's their problem, without again recognizing that patriarchy and violence against women for the sake of upholding patriarchy was something that was introduced through colonization and through white Christianity. So again, indigenous women in Northern America, Métis, First Nations, Inuit, across many cultures, the fact that a woman would be a leader was very natural. And again, when we look at that gender binary that came from European Christian ideals, that this is women's roles and this is men's roles, that's where we see indigenous women's voices and leadership being undermined, often through the introduction and enforcement of violence. So something that we can often talk about is the whole like princess, the virgin whore dichotomy, where Victorian women, white women, who adhered to those ideals of like fragility and kindness and softness and sexual chastity were the standard, and then indigenous women who had sexual freedom, who had access to power, who made their voices heard, were then again were viewed as anomalies and as again within the dichotomy as the whores, and who again had to be controlled for the sake of colonization. And again, at the same time, when we look at the history of enslavement and anti-Black racism in Canada specifically and in Northern America, Angela Davis writes it perfectly. When enslaved African Muslims were originally brought to the colonies, they quickly became known for rebellion. And it wasn't until the abolition of slavery, where the mass majority of Black Muslims were subject to regimes it wasn't until the abolition of slavery, the vast majority of Black women were subject to regimes of punishment that differed significantly from those experienced by white women. So public punishment, humiliation, how Black women and Black people were really navigating through the world, all of that was under this umbrella and under the oppression of enslavement and white supremacy. So currently, when we look at the histories of, for example, head wraps, right? How Black women were allowed to come out and exist in public spaces, and the enforcement of head wraps that was really a result of white women feeling threatened by the fact that white men were interested in Black women's hairs and different styles that they wore. So again, head wraps were enforced, and Black women's existence in public spaces and public realms was constantly policed to ensure that, again, those ideals of white supremacy are upheld, but also that Black women only show up within specific spaces and in specific ways. And again, their experiences in public spaces and in the public realm continues to be policed. And again, we see it in Canada, right? 5 Black Muslim women, all Somali Canadians who were wearing hijab, have been attacked or threatened in Edmonton in the first 3 months of 2021. And again, in Calgary, only 3 days ago, 2 other Muslim women were attacked So when we see that, how throughout history, Black women, Black Muslim women specifically have been treated, specifically in public places and in terms of public punishment, there's a lot to say about Canada as a country where 5 Black women just in the first quarter of the year have been impacted in such visible and violent ways by white supremacy, right? What is that saying about the safety and the status of Black Muslim women in our society and the role of punishment and public violence as a way of enforcing white supremacy and white patriarchy? So violence against women, I know all of this, some of it feels disconnected, but I think what we need to understand in terms of violence against women in politics is that it doesn't happen in a vacuum. And it's a continuation and an extension of everyday violence against women and serves a crucial purpose for maintaining that white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. So even when women are assimilated into these patriarchal institutions of power, our inferiority is asserted through, again, this continued objectification and tokenization, because the nature of that power has not changed. Right? We may be entering Canada's parliament, we may be voting and are voting usually at 2-3% more than men in the same age range. But, how has our status really changed? And again, is assimilation and is just like increasing those numbers doing us any good when the nature of that power and when the nature of decision making and the end goal of our political institutions has not really changed? Going a bit more into how violence against women currently manifests in Canadian institutions and in contemporary ways, I want to encourage us all to broaden our definition of women in politics to include women who engage with our civic spaces at different levels. So not just elected officials, not just appointed officials, but in order to create a clear understanding of our civic landscape and understand how women are civically engaged in so many different ways as leaders, as agitators, as activists, and of course, as candidates and elected officials. So some of the people who I don't necessarily see us pay attention to in this conversation are consultants, staffers, lobbyists, public servants, volunteers, visitors, journalists, and of course, elected and appointed officials. But it's really interesting because, again, looking at folks like public servants and political party staff, there are HR rep avenues, there are ways and policies and some protections in place for these folks. But when we look at consultants and staffers and lobbyists, people who are external to these, often external to these civic institutions, and whose safety and whose employment is governed by different legislature, and even consultants and lobbyists who, again, they show up to the Hill one day, a year or a few times a year, or interact with elected officials or other people in different spaces on a non-continued basis. There's often no conversation or no resources available for these people to report or address sexual violence. So I think it's really important for us to think about who are all of the actors that engage with our civic institutions and where are points of intervention and understanding when it comes to the violence and the marginalization they face that impedes on their ability to contribute to democratic or civic processes. In our work at Platform, we've spoken to specifically for our project on sexual violence against women in politics, so around 67 young women with a median age of 25, 80% of whom had either completely left politics or significantly decreased their engagement with civic institutions directly as a result of gender-based sexual violence. And I'm going to talk about some of the more prominent forms of sexual violence or gender-based violence and how they manifest in civic spaces to give you folks a clear understanding of how this regime of punishment against women who enter this male-dominated field of power and politics face. Sexual assault is one of them. And sorry, I want to make sure. So sexual assault it refers to any kinds of physical sexual contact without mutual consent. So it can include unwelcome kisses, groping, rape, or any other kind of unwanted act of sexual or physical nature. And it most often occurs at partisan gatherings, rallies, campaigns, offices. It happens on legislatures. It happens outside of civic or political spaces where, again, people are interacting maybe with political actors. And it can be perpetrated by anyone, regardless of their gender and position, right? I think a lot of times what we see in the media is usually like senior staffers, like chiefs of staff, or elected officials who are called out and who are accused of gender-based violence. The people we don't hear about are the party or like campaign volunteers. They're like the everyday staff members. They're potentially security staff who we don't hear about. So it's important to recognize that it can happen anywhere and by anyone. And I would consider it as an expert or as, as someone who's experienced gender-based violence in politics, as long as it is done within any of these spaces where politics or civic engagement is concerned, it is gender-based violence or sexual assault against women in politics. This is a quote from someone we interviewed, and it reads that I felt so shocked and offended that this well-known supporter and donor would objectify me in such a public setting. Everybody saw it and everybody pretended that like nothing really happened. So we really see how, it's so common and it's so normalized. And again, more often than not, people don't report it and people pretend that it doesn't exist just because it has consequences for the people who come forward. Again, you're going to give a bad reputation to the party. It's going to be bad. You're not a team player, or take one for the team, right? So that's how it manifests. There's harassment. So again, it's comments, it's personal questions, it's persistence requests for dates, and also comments about like someone's hair, voice, and body shape, right? Like a lot of women have experienced, your voice sounds too shrill, right? That's gender-based harassment. Comments about Black women's hair, right? Can I touch your hair? That is harassment. And then there's also cyber violence, which is any harassment that is, again, done through communication, digital or electronic forms of communication. And it includes both those sexist and threatening messages and communications, but it also includes doxing and leaking private information and photos of people. And this is where I really want to mention that intersectionality, again, matters, because this gender first approach that we've been having really leaves behind experiences of women in politics who are facing marginalization based on systems more than misogyny or sexism. And this was actually a study done in the UK and the US around women's experiences of harassment in the online world. And it found out that Black women politicians are 84% more likely to be targets of abusive tweets than white women. Asian and Muslim women are the most likely to receive threats mentioning ethnic, racial, and religious slurs. And it's Latinx women that are 81% more likely to receive tweets that are physically and specifically threatening than white women. So again, when we talk about the history of enslavement, when we talk about the history of colonization, this inherent devaluation of racialized women's bodies, specifically Black and Indigenous women's bodies, do play a key role in how we experience gender-based violence, and also specifically when we take on public roles, such as the women who were interviewed or studied through this process. And again, we must go beyond this gender first lens, even when we're talking about things like the wage gap. Although incrementally, white women's wage gap has been decreasing while it's been increasing for Black and Latinx and Indigenous women, specifically in the US and also in Canada. But it's because, again, we haven't considered all of those other pieces that go into the experiences of marginalized women in order for us to get a holistic understanding of what it is that we need to do to address these gender-based problems. It's also, aside from the experiences, it's also our treatment and our recognition of, violence against who is valid and violence against who is condemned, right? So we all know Catherine McKenna, said that in one incident, a car pulled up alongside her and her children as they were walking. They swore at her and they called her a climate Barbie. Again, they objectified her. They referred to how she looked, and really, they were really trying to address their opposition to her policies, her environmental policies, but they had to objectify her in that sense, in that sexist sense, and call her a climate Barbie. And we're all familiar with the Twitter backlash against that comment and the support that came out for her, which was great. I was one of those people. I was like, that's not fine. But then we have someone like former MP Selena Caesar Chaban, who called out a well-known racist MP, Maxime Bernier, on his white privilege. And it led to a lot of racist harassment against her coming from Bernier and his supporters, and also just like white supremacists online. In her book and in her conversation, she mentions that her colleagues and a majority of people were silent on this treatment that she had by Bernier and his supporters until 2 or 3 weeks later, when the Here for Selena hashtag emerged. So we're talking about two women in the same caucus that supports adding women and changing politics, but where racism against a Black woman is not recognized, and she describes uses the word radio silence coming from her colleagues in this 3-week period. And it wasn't until the Here for Selena hashtag emerged where everybody else got on this, bandwagon as well. So who is, granted protection? What, it's white women. It's white women's innocence. It's white women's womanhood that we need to protect. Whereas racism against Black women, and mind you, the only Black woman in Parliament of Canada, was something that was treated as if it didn't happen. And it wasn't until it became cool and trendy that even some of her own colleagues were providing her with support, or at least tweeting about it. When we're talking about sexual violence against women in politics and staffers, this was around the first Me Too wave, where former MP and then leader of Ontario's Progressive Conservative Party, Patrick Brown, was accused of sexual misconduct by 2 women. He did step down from his role as the leader, but then a month or so later, a few months later, he started running for mayor of Brampton. And he was elected, and he's currently a mayor. So he is still a very powerful player in Canadian politics and in Brampton politics. But all of that to say is that what's the point of survivors coming forward? What's the point of people stepping down if we're not actually interrogating the ways we support survivors, and we create political institutions that make it clear to abusers or to accused abusers that they're not welcome in these spaces? Because we were all raging, but he was still organizing, and he was still campaigning, and he was, he got votes, like people voted for him, and he got elected with all of that going on. And even right now, sorry, I think I skipped something. Oops, sorry, I haven't. Okay. Even right now in Ottawa, there is a city councillor, Rick Ciarrelli, who was found to have done horrible things. And again, there was a report by the integrity commissioner of the city that came out and said, like, this person is horrible. He has done all of those things, constantly abusing and harassing his staffers over the years, who is still sitting on Ottawa City Council. And I want to mention that our municipal act in Ontario allows for the removal of city councillors who contribute to financial mismanagement and misconduct, but there's nothing about sexual misconduct and racism, and again, just human misconduct in there. And again, he still sits on a council when countless women and staffers have refused or left politics because of that harassment. And again, because of the fact that women's voices are anomalies, that our contribution to these systems is not a natural part of these patriarchal systems, violence against women is a necessity. It's a feature of this current political system that we currently have. And in order to challenge violence against women in politics, here are some of the things that we can do. You know, I could come out here and say, these are the list of policies that I want. You need to go out there and advocate for this and that. But in order to inspire long-term culture shifts that not only support women in politics and create safe spaces for us, but actually change the nature of power so that we are challenging white supremacy, that we are dismantling all of these systems that impact our lives in such negative ways, we need to reject representation politics and respectability politics. Representation politics is the assumption that the voices, opinions, and perspectives of citizens, specifically women, and especially those with intersecting marginalized identities, is present when a member of that marginalized group gains access to power and influence within a dominant system. So as long as one of us or a few of us are in the House of Commons, we're represented, politics is working for us. But then there's also respectability politics, which are rules for people to follow in order to earn the respect of mainstream culture and in order to access dominant power. So, you know, you can be Black, you can be Muslim, you just don't have to be too Muslim, or you can't be one of those Muslims or those Blacks, right? That again, I'm using the term Blacks because again, that's the terminology people use. And I don't use that in my everyday life context. But you know, you can't be Black, you just can't be too Black. You can't talk about racism or, you know, Maxime Bernier and his supporters are gonna come for you and we're not gonna support you. So again, that's respectability politics. You know, like a woman can show up to the workplace as long as she's not on about all of that, her like equal pay and feminism bullshit, like that's fine. So again, rules for accessing respect within a dominant system, but also the idea of representation when just a body or someone who resembles you is in there. And what happens is that we get instances like what happened to Jody Wilson-Raybould, who was celebrated as Canada's first Indigenous woman Minister of Justice. Yay, we got an Indigenous woman in there and in such an important role, but then who was pushed out and literally expelled from her caucus once she stopped being a team player again, and led and did things based on her Indigenous teachings, her personal teachings, and also the teachings that were based on her big house. So, you know, representation, we got that. She's there. It's gonna be good. The government's definitely not racist or colonial. And the moment that she stopped adhering to that, her role of just being an Indigenous woman, being a part of the caucus, ticking that box, and also doing some great work, the moment she stopped playing by the rules, the moment she stopped leading the way they wanted her to lead, she was suddenly an anomaly. She was no longer adhering to respectability politics. And again, she was removed from that situation. In terms of policy, and you know, those of you who are engaged in politics or those of you who have power and influence in those spaces, I think we need to develop strong anti-harassment policies that reach women again from across the civic landscape, that have language, that have support system that meet the needs of women, regardless of where and how they're interacting with civic spaces. We need to provide ongoing training on recognizing and addressing gender-based violence, including sexual violence. So not just legal education. A lot of parties get lawyers, and I know the Senate of Canada, like it's basically legal compliance training that they get. Like this is within the law, this is what sexual harassment is, and this is what consent is. And what this says is that as long as the sexual violence you're perpetuating meets these standards, you're not going to be held accountable. But we need culture shifts, we need trainings around what consent is, what gender-based violence is, in order to be able to create a political culture that works in an anti-oppressive way to mitigate the impacts of this broader gender-based violence and like misogyny and sexism that plagues our culture. But we also need to develop supports for survivors and those who have experienced sexual violence that are both internal accountability mechanisms, but that are also external mechanisms for support that are survivor-based and don't have necessarily any commitments to that political institutions, and can really focus on allowing that survivor to address healing or access supports and whatever it is that she needs, while continuing to engage safely with those civic institutions. But I think I also wanted to add this, but there's also this sentiment that as long as we have women in the House of Commons, or as long as we're increasing the number of women in leadership, we're going to be good. But I actually challenge that, right? Because women can take on the values of patriarchy, and women can perpetuate sexism and racism and oppression in different ways. And again, we have like former MP PM Kim Campbell, who literally went on record and said, like women who wear sleeveless dresses are like, demeaning themselves. Like, I can't believe they're, showing up with like sleeveless dresses or shirts among men who are fully suited. And so again, these ideas around respectability politics, about how women should behave in professional settings or in leadership positions, we don't need women who believe in that. We need women who understand that, we need feminists in political spaces. We need people, women, trans people, like people who, regardless of their gender, are committed to understanding that our civic institutions and our decision-making bodies are upholding a certain type of white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, as Bell Hooks said. And in order to be really working in anti-oppressive ways, to dismantle all of these things, and to not only just challenge violence against women in politics, but also broadly in society as well. So it's 1:47. I know I took 2 minutes longer than I promised, but I hope that gave you enough information to understand what it is we're talking about when we say women in politics, and the different aspects of history and culture and institutions that maintain it.
You earned every 2 minutes of that you went over, and thank you so much, Arzu. But we want to get right into questions, if that's okay with you. And I want to start off with a question that one of the participants submitted. As the subject of a significant amount of deeply personal abuse and harassment as an elected official in the Niagara region, something I hear quite frequently in the flood of support that always follows, and for which I'm very grateful, is if you leave politics, you let them win. I'd be interested in your take on that statement.
I'm someone who's left politics because of sexual assault and gender-based violence, again, intersecting with racism and ageism and all of those things. So I just want to say solidarity with you. I know it's not easy, especially when, again, you're doing something that you're passionate about and you're constantly facing violence while doing that. I personally would say that you don't owe it to anyone to do anything. I think the issue of gender-based violence, the issue of sexual violence, racism, all of these things, they're so much bigger and larger than just one individual. And I really think that if it's impacting your mental health, if it's impacting your ability to show up and to be able to advocate and lead in ways that feel authentic and true to you, it is not necessarily, there are so many ways that you can get involved and make change and impact decision-making, that I wouldn't necessarily call it letting them win, right? Because what are they really winning? At the end of the day, you know your power, your voice, and you have your supporters, and you can always come back and impact politics in different ways. But it's also the responsibility of everybody else around you to fight this, right? It's not the responsibility of the oppressed to show up and to teach the oppressors and to fight them 24/7. I think there is so much to be said about people, allies, and people in solidarity with you, who I would encourage actually take action and stand up in solidarity in ways that you may not currently feel safe to do. So again, it's a far more personal question, but I think really being able to do what's best for you and really just saying no. It's like, no, I'm not going to participate in this patriarchy. I'm not going to let myself be subject to this anymore, if you can. Because we know there are a lot of women in a lot of situations that can't leave. But as an elected official and as someone who does that, I think if leaving is the best choice for you, then power to you, do it.
Thanks, Arzu.
Another question that came in said, how do increasing rates of gender-based violence during the COVID-19 pandemic relate to or demonstrate violence against women in politics? Did the pandemic change the nature of violence against women in politics?
So again, as we've seen, I would say someone like Dr. Tam, who is a woman in a decision-making or very public decision-making power, in the middle of the pandemic, and who also is Asian and who also speaks very candidly about the failure of our country to ensure that marginalized people are not severely impacted by COVID in ways that white folks in Canada or privileged people in Canada are not. We've been seeing it online, the Twitter abuse, the harassment, and some of the stats that I shared with you affirm that. Obviously it's increased, it's been twofold, and again now in a space where a lot of us aren't meeting public in person, all of that has moved online. So I think looking at how a lot of, just like every space, digital space is a facilitator of violence against women, is definitely going to provide us with some great insights, again, just like research has shown around how, again, violence against women just shapes forms and adapts to different spaces and different ideologies and different times, in order to ensure that, again, that status quo is maintained. So it's definitely increased, and it's also showing up against people who previously might have not had the visibility in order to receive those attacks, as we see with our public health officials right now.
Arzu, we've had a number of questions from male participants who are asking, as a male or as a white privileged male, how can I support change, and especially against violence against women in politics? Comments on those questions?
I think it really comes down to, allyship in any space, right? I think a lot of times, I think there are two things. I think one of them is just giving space and making sure that you're actively having these conversations. I recently wrote a piece for the Hill Times. This is the first time, it was the first time I publicly shared this, but the first time I went to a political conference, again, trigger warning for sexual assault, but I was 16 and I was sexually assaulted at a young liberal policy gathering in Windsor, Ontario. It was my first ever political gathering. I'd only become involved with the party maybe a few months prior. I knew nobody. And it wasn't until this year that I called like some of the folks who were in leadership back then and said, hey, you remember that trip that we had? It's like, hey, this happened to me there. The reason it took me so long is not necessarily that I didn't know it was a bad thing that happened to me or that I didn't deserve it, but it was because no one had ever talked about it. I was a random 16-year-old girl. I'd immigrated to Canada 2 years ago. And I really did not know, what do you do when you're sexually assaulted by some random guy in a random city, right? So having conversations, and if you have the power of decision-making, bringing in trainers, developing policies, making sure that your volunteers, everybody who's sharing this space with you understands that gender-based violence, sexual violence, misogyny, these are things that do manifest in these spaces that we enter. Recognizing it and also making it very clear that that is not okay, that won't go in this space. I think that will make a clear difference in not only hinting to perpetrators that we're not going to, deal with that, that's not acceptable, in ways that, our political system failed to do that for Patrick Brown, right? He left one position and then he got elected to another one. Our political system allows for perpetrators or accused perpetrators to do that, right? So we need to make spaces that tell people that that's not okay, but to also, by having conversations, by having survivor-centered, trauma-informed resources and conversations, we're also hinting to survivors that this is a safe space, that if you're, you don't have to necessarily report to me, but we have a list of resources. We have an external consultant. We're working with this organization to provide support. And I think that's also really important. And what we do at platforms sometimes is we offer it to campaigns. We say, hey, election campaign is coming up. provide our resources, provide our contact information to your volunteers and your staff, so that they not only recognize gender-based violence and how it manifests in civic institutions or on campaign trails, but that they may also at least have some form of external resource or contact to reach out to, which they do. And we see like an increased number of outreach emails, or, this happened to me emails during election campaigns. But again, making sure that you have survivor-centered external resources that are just supporting survivors, but then also either having conversations with your buddies or informal spaces, or in more formal and political spaces, having the policies, having the trainings, having the conversations to ensure that you are facing this problem head on and not really, hiding it.
Just before we go back to Diane to ask another participant question, you mentioned training, and you've talked about the training that exists now and how you'd like to see that change. Is there an exemplary training program that you would recommend, or comments on that?
I'm so bad at self-promotion, but Platform does that, and we actually have resources for training campaigns and political spaces. And the reason we do this is because there are so many amazing consent trainings, sexual violence prevention and support educators who understand sexual violence in an intersectional and anti-oppressive ways, and who do this. But there are not a lot of people who understand the specific power dynamics and the struggles that exist in political systems, specifically when it comes to an oppressive, highly partisan and kind of, I don't know the word, but trivialized political structure. So I think what our training really does is, I've operated within a political party. I've been a survivor within a political party. Now I work with candidates and folks on different campaigns, whether they be partisan or nonpartisan, on the municipal and grassroots level. I know what the shortcomings, whether it be in terms of finances and the ability to bring on trainers, or just in terms of a lack of political will for people to have this conversation as a collective, are. So again, I have, and our team, I think we have a very multifaceted and deep understanding of specifically how within a political dynamic, sexual violence manifests, and how it's permitted, how it's normalized, and then how survivors are pushed out. So we are trying to do that. And again, as a youth-led volunteer-run organization, we're re-traumatizing ourselves every time we have these conversations, but recognize that a lot of times the training that's being offered does not necessarily focus on the specific needs of survivors who don't want to leave politics. I just don't want to come forward and make sure that this perpetrator leaves, and then I have so much trauma that I myself can't engage in politics anymore either. We want to make sure that we're holding people to account, that we're creating safe cultures, but that we're also supporting survivors access whatever it is that they need while they continue to exercise their inherent rights to be heard and to be safe.
Thank you.
Another question was, how would you suggest women, especially Black, Indigenous, and racialized women, safely get involved in politics? Where would you suggest starting?
I think in any space, having a support system that will be there for you, regardless of the decisions that you make and how you choose to engage with politics, is key. Especially knowing that as Black, Indigenous, and racialized women, more often than not, we're not supported by any institutions or any spaces that are offered within the institutions that we're engaging with. So it often falls on us to make sure that we have safety plans, that we have networks that support us and show up for us. So I think making sure that you're being honest with yourself around why you're getting involved in politics and how you're getting involved in politics, whether it's institutionally in terms of partisan politics or if it's grassroots, making sure that your heart is in it, because that's going to make a real difference in not only just how you show up in those spaces, but also the impact that you can have. But also, again, making sure that you have your ride or dies, right? I think that's really important. And Selena talks about it, Jody talks about it, and I certainly talk about how it's really important to know that there are people who will support you and show up for you when you're actively being marginalized and violated within these oppressive systems.
Arzu, unfortunately, this is the last question, but you opened with that you're passionate about this topic, and you could talk much longer than the hour that we had today to discuss and have you present. But how that passion has stayed, it's stayed alive. So we want to know, what progress have you seen that gives you hope? What keeps you involved and giving the amount you're giving?
I haven't seen any progress, and I often joke with people, the conversation around women in politics has not changed since I was 14, and I don't think it will change much moving forward. And that's what a parliamentary study on the status of women in Canadian politics. And this was like 2 years ago, and they were asking the question of, why don't women get involved in politics? And you've been in this field and you've been in the world for far longer than I have, but I think the question has remained the same since you were maybe my age, and maybe if a few years before I was born even. The question where we should be asking is, why do women leave politics? Right? Why aren't women more actively involved in politics? And again, I said 80% of young women with a median age of 25 either leave or significantly reduce their engagement with Canadian politics because of gender-based violence and sexual violence. So we are working within a political culture that seeks to assimilate and to tokenize women while constantly violating us, and again, kicking us out the moment we stop being team players and play by the rules. So we really need to be talking about changing our political culture and our society in general, to ensure that we're doing things in ways that are not just maintaining the status quo, but that are actively working to dismantle patriarchy and racism and discrimination in all of its forms. And I think for us, I think for me, it wasn't hope that got me involved, and it wasn't hope that got me started in this work. It was a question of survival and necessity, right? Like, I was, sexually assaulted, like on Parliament Hill, in different spaces. So you either speak up or you assimilate and you suffer and you become one of them, and you end up perpetuating like their narrative. So I think for us and as platform, what we want to do is not get more women involved with Canadian politics per se, but to create an atmosphere and a support system so that young women, marginalized women who we know are leaders in communities, have access to the support systems and the resources they need, but that are also supported should they should they choose to engage with more institutional and formal systems of power.
Arzu Najibzadeh, thank you so much for your presentation, for the heartfelt, genuine responses that you've given to the questions that came in for you. And there were many more. We just don't have time in this particular session to address those. And I want to remind people, there were a number of people who asked in the chat box and in question and Q&A, whether there would be a recording that they could access. And thanks to the generosity of Arzu, then yes, this recording will be on the Learning Network website, and it will go up within a couple of days. And just a reminder to please complete the evaluation survey. There will be a link in the chat box to it. And that really helps us in terms of planning for future resource spotlights. Again, thank you for your passion, and thank you for taking the time to share your knowledge and experiences with us today, Arzu.
Thank you.
Bye. Hope to see you next time.
Bye.